Hi, I'm Jim Zogby, and welcome to Viewpoint. The presidential nominating process officially got underway Monday night when Iowa held its first in the nation caucuses. 99 counties across the state, thousands of precincts, and literally hundreds of thousands of folks turned out. There were some surprises. There were some upsets. Two candidates ended their campaigns, now three, I think. And one contest was so close that some delegates had to be awarded based on a coin flip. Here with an expert analysis of what's going on in this election and what we can expect to come is political journalist Kiely. She, until recently, was the Washington news director for Bloomberg, and before that, managing editor at Sunlight Foundation. She was also, before that, a managing editor at National Journal, spent over a decade reporting on Congress and national politics for USA Today, covered every major presidential campaign since 1980. And you were on the show when you were at the National Journal.
I was.
My old show.
I've been on this show in many incarnations, both for you and for me.
Let me start with Iowa. It was an interesting contest, and I want to, if we could, kind of go through the lineup, but just at the top, who was the biggest winner?
Well, I would have to say Ted Cruz was the biggest winner, and of course he won, but I think by beating expectations he was by far the biggest winner. And then I would also say, again on the Republican side, Marco Rubio by placing third and really making the strongest showing of those quote-unquote establishment candidates. So that gives him a big lift.
And the biggest loser?
Maybe Trump, because he lost the expectations game. And then obviously I think there are some other people who have since gotten out of the race, Mike Huckabee, Rick Santorum, Rand Paul. Obviously their showings were so poor that it led them to leave. But I would say of the candidates who were really contenders, Trump. Although I don't think that takes him out of the race.
Let's start. I want to go down the list. Rubio. I heard his speech. It was two speeches, and I was struck by that. His sort of victory, concession / victory. It's sort of become a standard feature. I mean, President Obama's, then candidate Obama's New Hampshire concession
I was there
speech
for that. It was
actually
amazing.
Became sort of I think almost as transformed by Will.i.am, became an anthem, and may have accounted for a significant part of his catapulting of the campaign into the next round.
There's an interesting story behind that speech that maybe some of the candidates could take a moral from. And it's interesting. I was working for USA Today during that campaign, and I had been assigned to do a big feature story on Barack Obama that was going to be the cover of the newspaper because the editors were convinced he was going to win New Hampshire and then party over for Hillary. So I went and I worked on this story for a long time, and I then was trying to get an interview with Obama, and finally I did. It happened on the afternoon of primary day in New Hampshire, and I went down and I met him and his press secretary at the hotel they were using for their headquarters and did this interview. And it must have been about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was close enough to my deadline that I sat in the car outside and typed in my quotes. But I kept thinking to myself at the time, gee, I'm really glad I got this interview. My editors will really be happy about the quotes, but shouldn't you be out shaking hands or something? Because I know Hillary is. And sure enough, Hillary won that primary. And having talked to Obama that afternoon, I knew that had to be a total surprise to him. He was completely confident he was going to win that election. And so several hours later, after my story was tossed aside because it was no longer relevant, I was driving down to Nashua to cover that very speech. And you could have cut the gloom with a knife in the room. It was a high school gymnasium filled with Obama supporters, and they were so sad and downcast. And then he came in and rocked the House with that speech, which was the first time he used the call and response, "Yes, we can." And I was just, it was an astonishing speech. And
Made even more astonishing by Will.I.am.
yes.
Just
But it was an
breathtaking.
inspirational speech
Yeah,
to his
to begin.
supporters,
Yeah.
whether they were Will.I.am
Yeah.
or the folks in this
Yeah,
gym.
yeah.
But what was so interesting to me is months later, I was in Europe where then candidate Obama was taking a tour of European capitals, and I covered his speech in Berlin. And because of the time difference, you actually could go and have a drink at the bar afterwards. We weren't working super late. And I ended up talking to one of Obama's speechwriters, and I asked him, I said, I want to ask you about that speech in New Hampshire, because I said, I interviewed him 4 hours before, and I know he thought he was going to win. How did you pull out that speech, that amazing speech, in such a short time? And the speechwriter said, it was the same speech. It was the speech Obama had intended to give as his victory speech, and he changed one line, which was to say, I want to congratulate my opponent, Hillary Clinton, on a great victory. But I think the point is,
I got to go back and listen to it again.
he had a plan.
Yeah.
He had a script. One of the remarkable things about Barack Obama as a politician is his ability not to get rattled and not to let events take him off course. And I think there are certainly a lot of candidates who could learn from that.
Well, the thing about Rubio's speech was that it was two speeches. It was the inspirational piece at the end that was he's now being attacked by some of his opponents for sort of canned remarks. But then there was the upfront part that I want to ask you about, because it was, I would say, mean-spirited. Hillary Clinton can't be president. She broke. She's a criminal. She broke the law, whatever. And he went down the list of his opponents. And I thought back and I said, John McCain never gave a speech like that. Mitt Romney didn't give a speech. George W. Bush didn't give a speech like that. And Bob Dole might have made mean comments, but they were always so cute that it didn't come off mean as much as it was just funny. It was like Johnny Carson late night humor. There's a lot of that in this Republican primary, mean digs and jabs. You might say Trump introduced it, but I don't think so. I mean, they've been going at each other all along the way. And that's different and new. And does it work?
Well, we'll see. I think one of the interesting things about Rubio, as one of my colleagues at Bloomberg, Sahil Kapoor, has pointed out, there's a bifurcation in that personality. He really sold himself and introduced himself to the national stage as a very optimistic, future-oriented kind of guy, and that was his message. He was having trouble getting traction in a field that, as you've pointed out, is tapping much more into the anger in the electorate, and so he's shifted his message. He hasn't entirely given up on the sunny optimism, which I think all politicians who do that are
It was
kind
the
of,
second half of the speech.
yes,
Yeah.
but he is, it's kind of modeling yourself after Jack Kennedy, the new frontier, and we're going to look towards the future.
Yeah.
But I think what's happened here is that there's a real anger in the electorate, and I think some of these candidates are feeling that expressing that or echoing it is the way to win, and we will see how that works.
It came off to me so awkward that it was almost schizophrenic. It was what you're saying explains it, that the second half was the speech he started with,
right,
and then the first half was, this is what I got to do to keep this crowd happy.
I think that's exactly right.
Cruz intrigues me because he has fashioned himself the evangelical. The question is, does he become another Huckabee and Santorum that wins the 60+% of Iowa evangelical voters and then fades quickly? Or can he remake himself? I mean, Cruz started with his speech with "To God be the glory," and Rubio a couple of times referred to Jesus as our Savior. That works in Iowa. I don't think it works everywhere else. Tell me a little about how Cruz goes to New Hampshire and beyond.
Well, I think Cruz New Hampshire is not going to be Cruz's state. So he's there, but I think that the interesting thing will be to watch how he does in South Carolina and beyond. He is definitely, the interesting thing about Cruz is he also started out with a slightly different message. Cruz is really a strict constitutionalist, Tea Party kind of guy, and very limited government. That's really where his sweet spot is. That's what he likes to talk about. I think he's appealed more and more to the evangelicals. Obviously, that's a smart strategy in Iowa because that's a huge proportion of the Republican caucus vote. More than 50%
This
are
election was
self-described.
64.
It's a huge number, always in Iowa. And so clearly that was a strategic move. That's not to say that he doesn't sincerely believe those things, but he was certainly emphasizing it more. I think the question will be as he moves into other states, how much does he emphasize that? And then beyond that, I think the conundrum for him is the general election. How do you, with a message like that, which may be quite successful with Republican primary and caucus voters, how do you succeed in the general where you have to appeal to a more centrist vote?
Trump. The interesting thing about Donald Trump is that from the very beginning, he was counted out, and after every flub that he'd make at a debate or some comment that was just outrageous, that the undoing of Donald Trump, it wasn't Trump that was underestimated. It was the electorate that wanted to hear what Donald Trump said. And almost like the superhero Sandman, the more that they punched him, the stronger he got. But can he sustain a loss and another loss if he loses New Hampshire? I mean, if this catapults others into the forefront? I mean, how strong is that support among an electorate that wants somebody who strikes out in anger if he doesn't win with it? And can others absorb that anger and become victorious?
Well, those are all really good questions. I think, in a way, Trump kind of beat himself in Iowa by making himself and others believe he could win it. I think that was always going to be a tough state for him because...
when you go to put money, when they pass the communion plate, and you go to put money on the plate, it doesn't quite work as a good evangelical, right?
Yeah, well, and so I think, but even that, I think people were willing to, I think the thing about Trump that for his supporters, he can break rules because he's so outrageous. I mean, I remember when I was in Texas working for the Houston Post, and Charlie Wilson, who represented this Bible Belt district, kept getting reelected over and over again, even though he had a new girlfriend every week and led this totally outrageous lifestyle. But he provided good constituent service, and we always used to joke, but I think it was in some ways true, that Charlie's constituents got to live vicariously through him. And there's some sense of that, I think, with Trump. People, he's tapping into this anger. The more outrageous he gets, the more people are thinking, that'll show those people who aren't paying attention to us. And so I think he can continue to defy the rules. And I think the reason, again, he kind of, he made his own bet in Iowa by suggesting he could win. He made a good try. But really, the fact that he didn't win Iowa isn't surprising. It looks like he will win in New Hampshire. And then the question is, can he sustain that?
Yeah.
And then I think for the Republican Party, and this is why people are so concerned, is could he really win a general election?
1/5 of Republicans say they won't vote for Donald Trump if he's the nominee, and 1/5 of Republicans say they won't vote for anybody but Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He has created a problem for the party, no doubt. Let's go to the Democratic side. Bernie Sanders was down 40 points about 3 months ago in Iowa. He ties. It is a tie. I mean, yeah, sure, she got 4 more delegates out of 1,000 plus, but 6 of those were decided by a coin toss. And Chuck Todd said the other day that the odds of winning 6 coin tosses in a row are 1 out of 64,000. That's pretty good odds. I'd check the coin out if I were Bernie, but in any case, it was a tie. Does Bernie lose Iowa? Did he lose Iowa? Did he have to win? You know, I mean, how she's playing it as a win, and I'm not quite sure it's a win.
No, I think that's a win for Bernie because he certainly beat expectations in Iowa, and as you pointed out, he came from nowhere. I think, again, the question, though, is Iowa and New Hampshire are quirky states, and in New Hampshire, he's got a built-in advantage by being a neighbor and somebody who's very well known in the state. I think the question for Sanders is, can he sustain this outside of those 2 states where, you know, when you get outside, the first 3 or 4 states are special cases, but especially New Hampshire and Iowa, where there's so much concentration on those states for such an extended period of time, and the candidates spend so much time there and they do so much retail that it really enables an underdog to succeed. And I think the voters in those states kind of like to shake up the race, and they like to go with underdogs. But once you get past, certainly South Carolina and Nevada, but even once you leave New Hampshire, it becomes a very different campaign. It's much more a campaign of TV ads and airport tarmacs and big national strategies. So I think the question is, how much can he sustain that appeal? Now, having said that, I think, you know, Barack Obama proved that it's now possible to raise lots of money from small donors, that it's possible to build momentum and to sustain it, and that you don't have to be the top dog to win the race. But I think the question here is, and we've also seen, I think, a history in the Republic of people kind of going with that outlier candidate to send a message, and then
that's what I
kind
wanted
of
to ask you
backing
about,
off.
because Hillary Clinton is strong, but I think there's no doubt that she's wounded. I mean, I was looking at the entrance polls. They didn't do exit polls, they did entry polls. And among those who say, I want a candidate I can trust, Bernie wins by 73 points. She's not trusted, and she's not viewed as authentic. And I'm not quite sure, in some cases I tried to parse out the Bernie appeal. 74-year-old grumpy grandfather. It's weird that kids were falling in love with him. I think it had less to do with the message in some instances as it did with the sheer authenticity of the guy. I mean, he was right out there in your face and he was real. What does she do now? I mean, does she limp through to victory? Is there space for somebody else to get into this thing, or are we going to see this sort of odd couple fight it out now for the next several months?
Well, I don't know that. I mean, I think the jury's still out, because I think once you get into South Carolina and then the southern states, I think, you know, if Hillary starts to roll and get momentum, then I think, you know, that this moment has passed. So I think that question still remains to be answered. I think on the question of the authenticity, I will say that I'm a little bit sympathetic to women politicians because I think there's only one woman politician I can think of who I covered who was able to get away with being quirky and loudmouthed, and that's Ann Richards. Women always have to fit into a kind of a cookie cutter and be less risk takers. It's very, very hard. You know, it's unimaginable for a woman whose hair was as flyaway as Bernie's to win a political office. That's why I don't run. But I think so. I think there's a built-in problem there for a woman politician. We haven't really gotten to that point yet where we allow women to be as authentic as men. And then I think for Hillary Clinton the very thing that makes her in some ways a very appealing and good candidate, which is that knockout resume she's got, is also an albatross in a year when people are very, very angry with established authority of any kind, including the media, and are looking for a way to express that anger, and Bernie becomes a perfect channel for that.
Martin OMalley, resume, it's a good one.
Yeah, very good. And
didn't catch on at all, and ducked out at the end. Smart, I think, that he left. Why do you think he didn't catch on at all?
I think that's a great question. I think it's hard to be the middle-aged white guy, even if you've got great guns, you know, those great pictures of him playing the guitar, in a year when you're running against a candidate in Hillary Clinton who could make history. And then you have this candidate who, you know, even though OMalley, I would say, positioned himself more to the left, the Clinton and the Sanders campaigns are each offering a political revolution of a sort. She would be the first woman president, and then Sanders actually says, I want a revolution. So I think it's hard to be the sort of more conventional character in that mix, and this was just not his year.
The three guys on the Republican side I want to talk about, Kasich being one, and then Christie and Bush. They're the last three of the mix who have a chance in New Hampshire. Kasich seems to be doing fairly well in some polls. None of them did well in Iowa. Who do you think of the three of them could emerge as the establishment alternative? Because I'm not quite sure that Rubio fits that bill right now.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I think a lot of people look at Rubio as somebody who has crossover appeal, who can get both sides of the party. Among the three you talked about, and they all have invested very heavily in New Hampshire, it's really hard to say. I mean, Bush has the money. He still has a bigger war chest than anyone when you count his super PACs. And Christie, I think a lot of Republican establishment types I've talked to really still hold out hope for him because they think he's kind of Trump without the baggage. He's the outspoken guy, but a little has the government experience. And then Kasich, I think Kasich is he's very genuine. He's certainly got an impressive resume. But the question is, he's quirky. He's going to appeal to he has almost kind of a
He's the
religious
2016
appeal.
compassionate
Exactly,
conservative.
exactly. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays in Flinty, New Hampshire.
I want to go to the two parties now. Talk about wounded. I think that we're seeing fracturing on both sides. There is an opening, and your former boss, Mike Bloomberg, seemed to indicate that he might want to do it. What would it take, do you think? Would it depend who the nominees are to determine whether or not a third party candidate gets in? And is a third party candidate capable of healing the partisan divide? Because that I think is a big issue. Anyone who's in the field right now, whether it's Bernie or Hillary or Marco Rubio or the Donald or Cruz, would only exacerbate the partisan divide. I mean, I think that's very clear. And they could win, and their parties would be happy with a win, but nothing more is going to get done in the next 4 years than was done in the last 8. And so that's the question I have. Could somebody outside come in and heal it, or would they be a perpetual outsider?
I don't know. I think the question is, are we seeing the end of one or both of the parties as we know them? My
brother says America needs a third party, a Republican Party.
Yeah, or you've almost got a split in the Republican Party, and to some extent, too, in the Democratic Party, between the governing and wings of the party, the people who believe that there's still a reason to act practically and try to get a compromise, and then the people who are just blow the whole thing up. And so I really wonder if, I started to think about, and I would talk about this with other people in the newsroom, that if you had Donald Trump and Ted Cruz at the head of the Republican ticket, could you see something like what happened in France, where the right and the left came together to block Le Pen, and see it like a Joe Biden, Nikki Haley ticket or something like that? I mean, it's far-fetched, but I do wonder if we're getting to the point where the parties have existed so long in their current configuration, the ideologies they represent are kind of creaky, post-World War II. They kind of fit a post-World War II world that doesn't exist anymore. So I think the bigger question, I don't know whether the United States will ever have a multiplicity of parties, but could the two-party system that we have, could those two parties kind of rebrand themselves, or one be replaced by something different? You know, we didn't always have Republicans and Democrats. So I just wonder if we're at that point in our politics, and I think that's one of the things that I'm going to be watching as the year unfolds. I think it's possible.
And going back to the partisan divide, the bickering in Washington, at the end of the day, that seems to me to be the determinant almost as to how this election comes out. Is there anyone in the mix who can make a difference in Washington, or do we simply get, and I said last 8 years, actually it's been much longer than that. It goes back to the Gingrich era.
It's really, it's something that's been long in the making. I think what it's going to take to change that is a greater involvement by citizens. There's been a lot written about how gerrymandering contributes to this, how our fundraising system contributes to the polarization. There's a lot of things going here, but the biggest thing is people not voting. Not voting for Congress, not voting in the primaries. People seem to think, I teach college students, and I asked a bunch of them after the first Obama election, it was 2010, and I said, well, how many of you have gotten your absentee ballots for your local congressional elections? None of them. How many of you voted in the presidential election? All of them. And voting for president isn't enough. I mean, just ask anybody who's ever been president how hard it is to get anything done. And by the way, that's the way it's supposed to be in our system, checks and balances. But if you don't vote in primaries and you don't vote in congressional elections, you're tying the hands of the person you voted for president. And so I think until we really, as a nation, understand that democracy is a participatory sport, how lucky we are to have the ability to participate in it, and be willing to get informed and care enough to get out there and be on the field, this problem is not going to get solved.
I just spent last week in Iowa, and then I went to Chicago for a couple of events. And I thought to myself, as I've often thought, I would love to live my life in Iowa because the caucuses are just stunning as political activity. I mean, it's just, people are professionals about the game. They know just how to do it. And then when I die, I want to get buried in Chicago so I could keep voting.
Can you vote again?
Just
yes, I like that.
Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Kathy. That's all the time we've got. You can follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA, or check out our website, aaiusa.org. And on the website, you'll find the positions of the candidates on some key issues involving Middle East and civil liberties. We've been tracking all of them, and even those who've dropped out. Take a look. Thanks for watching. See you next week on Viewpoint.